Welcome, everyone. My name is Grace Cushman, and I am part of the team here at Synergos. Thank you for joining us today for Power and Representation in Media. Our session is part of the annual Synergos Global Gathering, which is a set of provocative discussions that are necessary for developing bridging leaders, the type of leadership needed to create a just, peaceful, and regenerative world. We are grateful for you today, and we encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the Zoom chat below. Feel free to type hello and where you're tuning in from via the chat right now so we can see where everyone's coming from. This will be a 60-minute conversation, and before we dive into the discussion, I would like to go over just a few quick Zoom housekeeping items. This is a webinar format, so everyone is muted, but you will have the full chance to interact with the moderator and speakers, as well as your fellow participants through the chat function, so definitely take the time to participate there. I now have the pleasure of introducing my dear colleague, Swati Chaudhary, who will moderate the discussion today. Swati is the Managing Director of our Global Advisory team here at Synergos. Synergos Advisory offers strategic counsel, grounded insights.
Thank you, Grace. Friends and colleagues, welcome to a discussion on power and representation in media. It's my privilege to be in your wonderful company today. If you haven't already, do introduce yourself on Zoom, say hello, tell us where you're Zooming in from. I'm here in Brooklyn. And folks, this is a conversation amongst all of us. So if you have a question, drop it in the chat window. I will be looking out for your questions because frankly, they tend to be much better than mine. And if we cannot get to all of them during the live event, we will find a way to address them. This conversation is part of our annual event, the Synergos Global Gathering. After this session, we will be sharing highlights of this event as well as others that you might have missed. And in the meantime, allow me to share that I've been really looking forward to this particular conversation because it's so personal to me. Let me share a story with you. When I was a child growing up in a remote part of India, before I ever met a white person, I had this doll with beautiful blue eyes, blonde curls, and milky white skin. Alongside playing with my doll, I was also reading Hindi translations of fairy tales like Cinderella and Snow White, and Bollywood was all around me, as was Hollywood later on, both with their preferences for white skin and fair and lovely messaging. You know, as an adolescent, I was surrounded with magazines with bold headlines about weight loss, how to please boys, and how to use bleach creams. But to be honest, I loved that doll. I loved reading fairy tales and magazines, and I absolutely loved the movies. Yet my media loves, with all that they highlighted and all that they left out, were reinforcing this narrative that beauty and happiness and respect were reserved for people who conformed to whiteness, to thinness, and to constructs like heterosexuality and marriage. Can you imagine? Media was already starting to shape my views about people who I had never met. And, you know, it wasn't until adolescence also that I saw Mississippi Masala, where for the first time I saw Black and brown love on screen. I remember watching Philadelphia, another Denzel gem, with Tom Hanks and Antonio Banderas in a relationship together, these alpha males. And then I was also reading a wider gamut of print media. This is not to say that these movies and literature are without their issues, but for the first time, for the time and place that they were at, they deviated from the mainstream. They presented me with much needed exposure, showed me wider representation, and offered this possibility that everybody can be deserving of beauty, love, and respect. So like me, media has been a powerful force for so many people around the world, guiding us in how to view ourselves and how to treat others. So folks in the audience, as we begin this conversation with our panelists, tell us using the window chat about a time when you started to recognize the effect of media in how you viewed yourself and how you may have treated others. And with that, allow me to introduce our fantastic panelists today. And panelists, would you mind just turning on your videos so people have the pleasure of viewing you? Our first panelist is Samita Mukhopadhyay. She's the executive editor of Teen Vogue. She's an author, an activist, a rabble-rouser on the edge of feminism, race, online movement building, and yes, sex. She is the co-editor of Nasty Women, Feminism, Resistance, and Revolution in Trump's America, and the author of Outdated: Why Dating is Ruining Your Life. Her commentary has been featured in major publications such as The Guardian, The Nation, and The American Prospect. She received the Champion of Sexual Literacy Award by the National Sexuality Resource Center in 2008 and a Hillman Prize in 2011 for excellence in blog journalism. Our second panelist is Logan Mesa, who is the lead organizer for Soul Sister Leadership Collective and the Black Girls Matter MIA Coalition. They have been organizing since the age of 17, have been a restorative justice practitioner since 2016. They are an artist, wordsmith, and professional fire starter. Logan is also participating in a multimedia initiative called Our Stories in Vivid Color, featuring Gen Z women, girls, and gender non-conforming youth from Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities across the United States and Puerto Rico. These youth are actively shaping the cultural landscape, even amid personal experiences of discrimination, violence, and the crisis of COVID-19. And last but not least, Sam Fader is the director of Disclosure, a Netflix original documentary, an eye-opening look at transgender depictions in film and television, revealing how Hollywood simultaneously reflects and manufactures our deepest anxieties about gender. Sam's films explore the intersection of visibility and politics along the lines of race, class, and gender in trans lives. Central to Sam's work is putting urgent activist issues into a historical context. Sam is decorated with support from McDowell Colony, the Jerome Foundation, and Ellen Stone Belloc Institute for the study of gender in the arts and media. You can go on and on about these panelists, but I will pause there. Panelists, welcome. You have turned on your video, I see. Wonderful. How are you all doing?
Great. Thank you for organizing this. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So Sam, let's start with you. And I would love to pick your brain on something, a very fundamental question here that can serve as the building block of our conversation. Why is representation a form of power? How does representation empower us as an individual, as a society? And what happens when individuals or groups are not adequately or accurately represented?
You know, I actually don't necessarily think representation in and of itself is a form of power. I think representation has its value, but power really lies in the decision-making roles, right? Of who gets and who gives and who takes access to power, right? And then from there, we see the possibilities. You know, do we share our power? Or do we hold it over people? You know, so representation is really just the end result, right? It's the mouthpiece of such power. And when we do see ourselves and we see our stories, we may feel empowered, which is great, but I'm more interested in who is in those decision-making positions. And that's, you know, that's what I'm interested in seeing change, you know, and that's also complicated because I'm not particularly interested in assimilation or mainstream visibility. I'm interested in how social justice movements can use storytelling to empower themselves as a part of the movement, right? Representation is a means to an end within dismantling power. It's not the end in itself.
That's really interesting. Samita, we were talking about that as well. That representation is not enough. And I would love to come back to that a little bit. But Sam, just kind of digging into that a little bit, if representation is the end result, what does it say when representation is not accurate or inadequate? What is happening underneath it?
I mean, I think it just speaks about who's making it, right? Like when you look, for example, with Disclosure, when you look at the history of trans representation, it's just very clear there's a lack of creativity on the part of the storytellers, right? Just kind of telling the same tropes and the same tired stories again and again without ever considering a trans audience, like what the takeaway would be for a trans person to see violence and hate and shame again and again perpetuated on your body, you know, on your identity. So it tells you so much about who's behind the scenes, and within how the stories are told. And I mean, I think for our project, that's why it was so essential that we prioritized hiring trans people. And when we couldn't hire a trans person, we mentored a trans person, and that deeply informed the result. And I think viewers can feel that and see that. And I think that's part of what people are kind of responding to in the film, is because when you center the people who have most at stake within the story, that really shifts the narrative and the power of the narrative.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And it reminds me, Logan, of our conversation a couple of weeks ago about a lot of media featuring non-conforming people are often laden with uncovering of pain. And we also talked about the relative shortage of stories about friendship, love, happiness, goofiness. So Logan, from the work that you do, the documentary that you're part of, and from your perspective as a person, tell us about the importance of positive images in media and not just kind of this trauma porn.
Yeah, just want to say thanks for having me. So when thinking about positive images and just being able to see yourself on a screen, that is so key for identity development, especially for adolescents, as you're growing up. Similar to how you shared with your story about the doll and whatnot. For me, as a young Afro-Colombian person living in the United States, who isn't fluent in Spanish, right? A lot of my media was centered around kind of the Black American experience. So oftentimes when I turned on the TV or I watched a movie, it always fell into one of four racist tropes, right? You have the Jezebel, the hyper sexualized person. Usually it's someone who's a feminine experience. Kind of the trope of I'll take your man, or that's my baby daddy, that realm. You also have the mammy, the person who is asexual, who is long suffering, who has to take care of the household and everyone, right? We see that so many times in different movies and in different TV shows. The trope of the welfare queen, have kids drain the system. And also, of course, the tried and true, the angry Black woman, where if you get her mad, she'll roll her neck and snap her fingers and all of that stuff, right? And growing up, seeing this, even seeing it in TV shows that are marketed for a younger audience as I was growing up, really made it challenging for me to even accept myself as someone who is Colombian, who is Black. And it especially made it very challenging when it came to different aspects of my identity, with my my relationship to my body, right? So I'm thinking about kind of there was this show called Moesha, which is about a young Black girl living in California. The show came out around the 90s, and there was this character in the show named Kim, and I see a lot of myself in Kim. And the running joke in the show was that Kim is fat and she's ghetto, right? So there's this one particular episode where Kim tries out for the cheerleading team and she gets in and Moesha doesn't. And it's kind of this whole thing of how come I didn't get it? This kind of very conventionally attractive, slim, smart, intelligent, well-read Black girl, but the fat Black ghetto girl got it, even though they're supposed to be friends, right? And that was kind of the running joke. But on the flip side, we can see very positive reinforcement. I'm particularly thinking about Doc Mcstuffins, which is a TV show that's marketed for younger children, kind of ages, 5, 8, and whatnot. And I've seen so many Twitter stories of folks who are I took my niece or my child to the doctor and they were crying full on meltdown. And a Black woman doctor walked in. And as soon as I said, look, she's just like Doc Mcstuffins, you can see the internal shift where they literally went, wow, she is just like Doc Mcstuffins. She's here to help me. She's here to protect me, right? And also showing that you can be Black and be a doctor. You can be a Black femme person and be a doctor. So yeah, so when I just think about uh representation and like positive stories, I feel like it's very, very key, but we have to be very careful that we don't go into the realm of like voyeurism, where we're exploding stereotypes and racist tropes just because it's a cash cow. There's a very specific level of responsibility that media has when it comes to telling stories that really needs to be taken seriously, because it directly links to how people relate to themselves and to each other and literally how we live in this world.
Yeah, and Logan, we were talking about also the commercialization of these stories, that who tells your story is important. And that we see a lot of kind of minority on minority interaction get relegated to like a section that you sort of need a non-minority person there for the minority voice to be legitimized. Can we replay that a little bit and can I pick your brain a little bit about how you view that and how that has affected you and what your perspective is?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that goes into like voyeurism a little bit more, right? So kind of like, of course, the summer, June, everyone's talking about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. The hashtags are popping up. You're going onto like the streaming platforms and the Black Lives Matter sections are popping up. And, you know, it's the commodification of like Black death is real, right? Where when someone dies and they become a hashtag, there's a level of humanity that's stripped away from them. Um, and when we think about like what is actually in that category of like the Black Lives Matter or censoring Black Lives section, you have stories about slavery, right? That's always the go-to. You have stories about kind of like love, but with a twist. So some type of like struggle love, like thinking about Queen and Slim. Yes, they're in love, but they're running from the police. Or yes, I'm in love with this person, but they're abusive and I need to get away. Right. So it's like you have kind of like the struggle love category. You have the really like playing into all of the tropes, you know, movies, right? So it's just kind of like there's a very small amount of stories that actually feature like real stories where folks are able to fall in love and like not have it be struggle love, or genuinely tell their stories and to not have it feel like that identity is being tokenized or commercialized or just completely stripped away and washed away of all of its value. Um, so yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. Like things just get categorized and we need to break out of these categories. Samantha, I want to come back to a point that Sam had raised that I know we discussed a little bit about why representation is not enough, and that alone doesn't get to the heart of power. What else is at play here for better redistribution of power, let's say? And how do you see this in your own work?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you as well for having me, and it's great to be on this panel with you all in particular. Everyone, everything everyone has been saying, I'm like, yes, exactly that, exactly that. You know, one of the things I think, Swati, that we talked about is one of the reasons representation is not enough. So it's this kind of double-edged sword, and I think that to what Logan was just speaking to, you know, it's kind of infinite possibilities of what our reflections could look like in the media. And when you come from an underrepresented community, we often put so much pressure on the few representations that may be out there that it can almost be really limiting. Like, you know, we were talking about like when like prior to Mindy Kaling, it was like the only representation for South Asians was like Apu on The Simpsons or some other like you know, terrorist in a movie, or, you know, like it was so limited. And when she kind of broke into the scene, she you know, shouldered a lot of the pressure of all of our needs, all of our criticisms, our frustration that like it was a really limited representation of what the South Asian experience is in the United States, and it didn't grapple with a lot of the issues. And it kind of puts a lot of weight on these individual moments, which, you know, she was also just trying to make a funny show. Like she wasn't necessarily trying to represent all kind of South Asians. And I think that there is a real danger in when we have this kind of overemphasis of never being satisfied with what we're seeing, rightfully also, and also that is not ultimately what's going to set us free, right? Is like seeing ourselves on NBC, and there is a power to it. I think, to Sam's point, it is empowering. It is personally empowering to see stories that we can relate to. But I think all of us can probably agree that there's characters that may not reflect our backgrounds that have been extremely revelatory, and not necessarily having the ability to always translate that and be able to say, well, actually this character who doesn't necessarily represent me, it's been a very powerful experience for me to see this character and their kind of story arc. And at Teen Vogue, I mean, one of the things that we are deeply committed to outside of representation on the actual pages of the magazine, web pages of the magazine, is that our staff reflects the stories that we're telling, and our staff reflects a changing America. And so Teen Vogue is, our editor-in-chief is a Black woman. I'm the executive editor. 2 of our 4 verticals are run by Black women, and our writers, reporters are, of like the backgrounds of the issues that they're reporting on, or they're just diverse backgrounds and they're reporting on issues that they care about and they're invested in. And that has just always been such an important part of what Teen Vogue does for the last couple of years. And I think even where I have worked before that, I mean, that is kind of, my interest is really in what happens when we are invited to the table and how do stories change. And I was just texting with this sounds so name droppy, but she is my friend, the editor-in-chief of Vanity Fair, Radhika Jones, and they have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They just released their December issue on the cover today, and we just had our cover come out yesterday, and it was Representative Ilhan Omar. And I was like, this is what it starts to look like when women of color run everything. you start to actually see this kind of fair representation. You start to see these kind of narrative change of what does it look like to be a woman in power? Who are those women? How are we kind of talking about these women? How are we covering these people? And how are we platforming them? Are these people that would have been put on the cover? You can't absolutely say they wouldn't be, but would they have been put on the cover had women of color not been at the decision-making table to kind of make those decisions? And so it is, I think, to both Sam and Logan's point, it's both this kind of the importance of having this diversity, but that diversity does not mean anything. That representation does not mean anything if it does not actually have sustained impact on the community, and if those representatives are not actually the people making decisions behind the scenes as well.
I saw the cover with Ilhan Omar and her daughter, and I saw the headlines in Teen Vogue that we need to show up for Black women in this election. And I saw this recent feature on whitewashing of historical figures in the context of Gal Gadot getting cast as Cleopatra. And I was really jealous that this representation is happening at a time when I'm not an adolescent, and in comparison to sort of magazines that were the topics and the people that were being featured in magazines when I was a teenager. So can I pick that a little bit with like, pick your brain on this? Is this here to stay, or is this a 2020 thing? Is this a fad, and will it go back to, like, is this a pendulum swing kind of thing, or is this a seismic change that we're seeing?
I mean, I hope so. I hope it's here to stay. But, I mean, I think a lot of things are happening at the same time, right? I think that there is, and this is not, Teen Vogue is one example. I think if you look at television, there's been a tremendous, I think, move towards diversity and creators of color, and, and I think there has been increased diversity in all of these different spaces around representation. I think a lot of, for media, like, this is happening at the same time that media is not really doing well as an industry. And so it is very hard to sustain these things until we get to a point where advertisers also want to put money behind some of these images. And they believe that this kind of diversity of images sells products ultimately. And I think that until we kind of can reconcile identity as a product of capitalist desire, it is very hard to kind of sustain a truly, revolutionary, a truly social justice vision of what we should look like and what our representation should kind of be. And so I worry that the pendulum will swing the other way. I do worry about that. And I also think if you look at history, that is how it happens, right? You have these moments where we are in a bit of a golden era right now, where there's just so many writers of color. There's so much amazing stuff happening. There's so much creativity. Everyone's like, go sell your TV show, go do this. There's all these streaming platforms. And if those don't all make money within the next 2 to 5 years, they are all gonna get canceled. And who then kind of ends up with the power? The person who decides to hire or fire you, and that's usually a straight white man. So I do worry about it. I kind of have I feel like it's one of those moments right now where I'm like, they let a feminist in, come on, like everybody run in while you can, because it does feel sometimes like I'm like, how are we pulling this off? I don't know, but let's just keep doing it and then let's see what happens. So I guess, I mean, I wish I had a crystal ball to like fully answer that question, but I think on some level, I think that some standards have changed around diversity, like even to say that, even to have the presidential candidates address questions of criminal justice, to have, the vice presidential candidates, like that to me is a work of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? I think that there are certain standards that have changed in public discourse and how we talk about these issues. But in terms of actual power to communities of color, I am less optimistic.
I wish you had a crystal ball too, because I'd ask you about the election next week, which is another pendulum swing, just sort of like hanging in tension right now. And Samhita, another thing that was not at play when I was growing up was social media, and how that is becoming, or has already become this like this massive, and for some people, majority of their news and their perspectives come from social media. And I see an amazing question from the audience, and I'd love to hear all your perspectives, because you're all kind of dealing with social media and creating social media in your own work. That how does the rise of social media intersect with young people's search for identity and representation in traditional forums? Logan, can I come to you first for this?
Yeah, could you repeat the question one more time so I can digest it?
How does the rise of social media intersect with young people's search for identity and representation in traditional forums?
Right. So I think that being able to cultivate what you're able to see, like when you wake up and you get on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or like whatever have you, I feel like it has allowed for folks to really tailor their experience. So as opposed to like, before the boom of like Instagram and whatnot, where it was just kind of like what you saw on TV, on cable, that's what you kind of got. Now there's literally millions upon hundreds of accounts of different content, body positivity, social justice, things that you can literally say, I want to follow this topic and this is all that I want on my timeline. So I feel like that's a very good benefit. It's really good for finding community, especially if you live in like a rural area, or an area where you can't really seem to find your folks, like find your community. And it really fosters like a sense of belonging. You feel less alone. Like I remember when I was like in middle school, I was on Tumblr a lot, right? And Tumblr back in like between 2010 to 2012 was not a good place to be. It took me many years to unlearn dieting, to unlearn just all of like the anti-Black messages and racist messages that I had like internalized because of like what that platform was really like about back then, back in 2010, back in 2011 and 2012. On the flip side, I also feel like a negative of it is that social media is around us so much to that it's almost like we're existing in this state of hyper arousal. So again, thinking about like when during the summer when everyone was going to marches and protests for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, thinking about how like people were sharing very graphic images. Even now with thinking about what's going on in Nigeria, people are literally sharing like dead bodies on social media, right? So it's almost like we're getting the information and we're finding the community, but we're also being exposed to this brand new level of trauma that didn't exist. And it's almost hard to figure out, how do you even navigate that? Because yes, you can mute certain words, and you can try to tailor your experience, but there is some level of trauma that will still seep in. So I feel like we're on a brand new front of figuring out, how do we responsibly engage in social media and find our community and find our belonging, while also dealing with the trauma and all of the mess that comes along with that.
Yeah, and the speed and volume at which it comes at you is just surpassing traditional media. Sam, what do you think about this? And how has your experience been with social media and the work that you're doing with your Netflix um, documentary?
My social media team is like 20 years younger than I am. And so I really, when Logan was talking, I was like, oh, you can mute certain words. There's so much I don't know about it. So I defer to people who are much more experienced with it.
Samita, any thoughts?
No, that's so funny, because I was like, middle school, like Tumblr, really? Like, you had to drop that? Like, I was like literally 30. Like, no, I mean, I think about this question a lot, as, I'm the generation that like invented social media and then like hates it. But I see, like, I worry, and I think something, before I worked in mainstream media. I used to run a blog called Feministing, like in the dark ages of the internet.
That was
And
you.
and it was pre-social media a little bit, and I think that we had a little bit of space to experiment with our ideas and build a community in a bit of a more hyper localized way, similar to, I think, what Tumblr later was able to do. And I think that I wish there was like more almost curriculum on the different places to have different conversations, because I think a lot of, like, to Logan's point about people, like, there's so much trauma that people project or put onto interactions that happen in public spaces. I think you have the pressure of performance, you have the pressure of, getting a retweet, you have all of these different kind of pressures of presenting online in a way that may not always be safe. And it can be challenging to be doing this kind of public work while also figuring out these questions for yourself, which often, are the most profound. And I shouldn't say I have not had profound conversations online, but the most kind of transformative conversations in my life are the ones that happen in person. They're the ones with people that we have a shared relationship, we trust each other. And when you're trying to have these very profound kind of social justice, identity focused conversations in a space as heated and public as, say, Twitter or an Instagram, I think it can get very, it can be daunting. I think it can be discouraging, especially if you're like 17 and living in, like questioning your identity in some way. And you're just looking to kind of be, you're just trying to be curious. And I think that the stakes feel very high now, and people do, I mean, they get canceled, they get, it is amazing to me how many young people I talk to that are afraid of saying the wrong thing in public. And I'm like, oh my God, like if people looked at my archive from before 2010 or 2005, or even when Twitter first was like on the scene and it was a tool that was just like for you and your friends to talk to each other, like game over for me. So I worry about that. And I think, the thing that I often suggest is to really like move it to text, like do a group text, like work out some of your ideas between your friends and people you trust and with your family, or maybe like a smaller kind of like I was going to say live journal, because that's what like that's what we used, but some place where you can kind of work these things out in a bit of a more kind of private environment before you dabble with presenting and having to kind of vet this stuff online. And then I also think that one of the things that I feel like, I also think that you can learn from your mistakes online too. But it's really hard. And I think especially now as we social distance and we go into the winter, like online is real life. Like people are like, well, that's not real. And one thing I think it's important, especially to younger generations, is like, that is their real life. Like that is the primary form of communication for Gen Z. Like that is how they're kind of learning about themselves and learning about these questions. And so I think like learning to separate, not taking things as personally and those kinds of things, and like really finding safe ways to have these conversations before trying to engage with them online. And then also trying not to like take it too hard when you are wrong or like when somebody calls you out online as well.
Yeah, being online is risky. It brings exposure, brings risk. And, I am no celebrity at all. And yet I'm seeing the effects of it, where I get LinkedIn messages from people, a little bit of stalking, people offering unsolicited advice about my hair, my appearance, about things that have nothing to do with the content that I'm producing. And for people who are non-conforming, a lot of this can be very risky. And, Sam, you have this amazing documentary called Disclosure, where trans creatives are sharing their perspectives and their analysis. And I was so struck by this message that representation can bring risk. There's a quote from one of the clips of Disclosure that the more we are seen, the more we are violated. The more positive representation there is, the more confidence the community gains, which then puts us in more danger. Tell us about this paradox of positive images and increased representation.
Yeah, I mean, often being visible puts the most vulnerable person in harm's way, right? And so when you're talking about trans people, 80% of Americans say the only trans people they know are the ones they see in film and TV. And that history, if you've seen Disclosure, is incredibly distorted, very dehumanizing. And we know violence follows dehumanization. And so when transness enters mainstream discourse and someone reads you as trans, suddenly all those distorted and dehumanizing images they've seen over their lifetime influences how they understand you, right? And those images come between you and them. And, the way we learn about people impacts how we treat them, right? So then the social and legislative, emotional and physical violence ensues. In making Disclosure, I had been making documentaries for 15 years, and I did believe in visibility for a lot of reasons. Seeing trans people in the way that you can feel excited about and proud of, rather than the fear and shame, is empowering. Like as we were talking about earlier, but then in 2014, when Laverne Cox was on the cover of Time magazine, and it was a beautiful photo, and she's wearing this incredible blue dress and looking defiantly down at the camera, and the headline says the trans tipping point, and there was all this celebration, but I was really concerned, right? Because the trans community I was surrounded by was still disproportionately underemployed, lacking access to safe housing and healthcare. And we know whenever a marginalized community gets mainstream attention, backlash ensues. So when all the mainstream knows about you has been so distorted and dehumanizing, there's a lot to fear about this sudden visibility. So Disclosure really reckons with that reality, and that's why we open the film with that idea, right, that the simultaneous increase of representation and the increase of social and legislative violence, and how do we make sense of that?
And so how do we as a society, Sam, sort of prepare to, does it have to be one or the other, that, you either have more representation or more risk, or what can we do to make this safer and de-risk higher level of representation, higher empowerment?
I mean, I think knowing our history is incredibly important, right? So that we kind of understand why, these ideas, like something as simple as like the whole bathroom bill conversation, like why that was even possible. I mean, it's deeply rooted in how people understand trans people. I mean, there's not a one-to-one relationship between images and violence, but it certainly impacts the cultural narrative. And especially going back to that statistic that 80% of Americans say they only know the trans people they see. So, if you think about looking at the history of trans people, and you see this trope again and again of like a man putting on a wig or a dress to enter women's space, that completely, you could start to understand why these bathroom bills, kind of took up like got leverage, and people grabbed onto that. When you see these images of a psychopathic killer again and again, you can understand why people fear the trans body, or when you see trans people being killed again and the blame is on them, right? They're to blame for their transness and for the violence they're experiencing. And you see this across all marginalized communities. So we can't erase this history. We can't forget it happened. And so I think understanding it helps us understand them. We understand the present and we can prepare for the future by knowing the past. Going forward, again, to circle back to the beginning of the conversations, we have to center the people whose stories we're telling, the stories that need to be told. We have to change the people who are in decision-making positions. That's the only way anything's going to change. It's not just going to be about enlightening those who are in those positions of power. Those people have to be replaced. It just has to be. Yeah. To me, it's really that simple, and they're not going to do it themselves. And so it's about us, those of us who have the slightest bit of power, the slightest bit of influence, and sharing that, right? And so it's like, how do we create more opportunities for the people we want to see in those decision-making positions? And, when I talk to other filmmakers and they're like, well, it's so hard to make a film. And I'm like, yeah, it's really hard to make a film. And it's all about the decisions you make and the choices you make. And we prioritized employing trans people, and that made our budget hard to raise. But that's where we decided to put our energy. So it's, everything is hard, but it's like, where do you put your attention? Where is the intention to your attention and the energy that you're going to put into your product? And that's what's going to lead to a change.
Yeah, so it's not just who is on screen, but who created that content, who made the decisions.
Absolutely. Who's on screen is the last thing that happens, right? The casting debate got a lot of, it's important, the casting around is it casting non-trans people in trans roles, versus prioritizing trans people in trans roles. That's something that got a lot of social media attention for good reason, but that's the last thing to happen. And that's not going to fix a bad script, right? So it's, the early days, like whose scripts are bought, who's writing them, who's in the writing room, then who is the casting agent, before we're even talking about who's casting, who's paid to cast people. And quite honestly, the whole Hollywood thing, it's interesting and important, but my passion is about the people on the streets. Like, how does this all affect the lived experiences of the people on the streets? So how are the stories that we're telling about a community affecting the real lived experiences of that community?
And Logan, you are in this documentary called Our Stories in Vivid Color, where, to Sam's point, who gets to tell whose story really matters, who gets to create the content really matters. So tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing, and how is the casting decided? Why does it, tell us about that experience, and how that makes a better outcome, or how is the outcome different? How are the stories different from, let's say, the regular mainstream?
Yeah, so I think what makes this particular documentary unique is that when it comes to kind of like filming, of course, we're in quarantine, right? So, it's not like the usual way of filming, but at its core, it was just kind of like, we, like, as the folks who are in the documentary, who are telling our stories, we're able to show what we want to show and tell what we want to tell. So whether that be going to a coalition meeting, taking a walk outside, just daily life, just daily things, we're actually able to literally like tell our own story, and do it in a way that's authentic and comes directly from us. So I think that that's very unique, and I'm very excited to like be part of it. Very excited for when it actually gets released. And I just think it's an amazing project. What was the other part of your question?
Yeah, and how did you all decide who the cast should be? Sort of like the importance of people telling their own stories, regardless of whether they are actor or actress or have experience. To Sam's point, who gets to tell the story is as important as who is on screen. And I was just curious how that played out in the documentary that you're part of.
Yeah, I actually became part of it. I somehow ended up on an email list, and I got an email from one of the folks who was part of like the directing team, and they were really looking to center voices of like trans and non-binary folks like in the South. Oftentimes when you see folks who are being highlighted, it's folks who are in larger cities, like you have New York, you have California, right? Like places that are seen as like more progressive. And oftentimes like the South is just seen as like, oh, just full of people who are racist, you know, full of people who are conservative, and, you know, the South is backwards, you know, but there's really intensive power in the South as it relates to organizing, as it relates to art, as it relates to storytelling. And people like me, you know, people who are Black, people who are trans, people who are non-binary, like we're out here, like we're in these streets, we're making noise, and we're really creating like different waves of culture. So that's kind of just how I became involved with it. So I would definitely say just like keep your eye on the South. There's some really cool things that are happening in Florida, in Georgia, and Mississippi. And yeah, just keep your eye on the South.
Yeah, we will. And everybody go watch this documentary when it comes out, and Sam's documentary as well. Panelists, as consumers of media, all of us, including the audience, what are some things to be aware of? What can we all do better? And I think the audience is also curious about what media you are consuming to gain access to wider, more diverse sources of voices. So maybe Samita, let's start with you.
So yeah, I mean, you know, I'm like very like social media. I'm like down on it right now, but I do follow a lot of people on Twitter just for, I think, the diversity of voices that are often not reflected in you know, in the papers and in magazines. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of different things that I read and kind of newsletters that I subscribe to really, you know, and kind of a lot of the contributors for Teen Vogue as well, write for other publications. So I follow, you know, what they're doing. And I think, you know, just in terms of media literacy, I'm having a personal existential crisis right now about the state of media. I think like I hit a bit of a breaking point the weekend that the Trump team contracted COVID, and the way that the media, like just the media circus around it, and that like beyond the fact that it was kind of inevitable, but I think it was kind of one of the first times I really like just watched cable news straight through the weekend. And I noticed I had more anxiety after that weekend. It was an anxiety inducing event either way, but I had more anxiety than normal. And the repetition and the kind of alarmist way that we continually talk about politics right now, and how everything is a crisis and everything is breaking news and everything. I mean, I think like I've definitely hit a saturate, like I've become oversaturated by that. And I think that it's had a really bad impact on Americans in general, and our ability to parse a lot of what is like really, you know, obviously that was a really big news story, but saying over and over that the president is lying, that's not like breaking news. Like that's like something that we've known since the beginning of this administration. And I do think that we're going to look back at this time, like historians are going to like, I mean, there's going to be a lot of PhDs work going on in looking at the impact that a highly polarized media has had for us, and the, you know, push to get clicks, the push to get ratings, how it's actually impacted how exhausted we are, how anxious we are, and how hard it is to really parse out, you know, how important is this story? How is this actually going to impact, you know, voting? How is this going to impact all of these other, you know, policy, like all of these other consequences that there is going to be, that's hard to parse out when you're constantly caught in this like bubble of reality TV crazy salaciousness. And so I've been not reading the news as much as I used to, and I've been trying not to watch it for sure. But reading headlines and, you know, reading the New York Times every morning to make sure I know everything that's going on, but really trying to unplug. I made a decision, which is wild, but I did it, to just not even watch the Amy Coney Barrett swear in and to watch, like, I just decided to be offline for that, because I was like, I don't have anything left in me this year to be outraged about this, because I first of all have to save my energy for next week, because we don't know what's to come. And just like now watching this, I think Swati, you called it like this trauma porn, but this like cycle that we've gotten into where something horrible happens and then we like are outraged, and then there's like the outrage performance, and it's very exhausting. And and part of it was, I know her confirmation was a little bit inevitable, so it was a kind of like a nothing burger news moment, but it was still like a profound loss for the state of our democracy and for everybody on this call's basic civil liberties. And it was, it was so upsetting, and I was just like, I can't, like, I actually like can't do this anymore. And that's a very long-winded answer to say that my biggest advice is to really unplug and to really start to read as little as you need to stay informed, and focus on other things, other ways to connect, and other ways to kind of build community, because it's not good for us.
Yeah, and anxiety is already so high in the pandemic. Just before this webinar, I had to take a walk around the block. I'm like, I haven't left my apartment in 4 days, and I just need to unplug for a minute. Sam, how about you? What are you reading? What are you tracking? What are you consuming? And what advice might you have for our audience?
Oof, I'm not sure I'm in the position to give advice to anyone right now. I listen to a lot of podcasts. That's kind of my thing. Social media does really stress me out for all the reasons that we've been talking about, and then not being part of social media equally stresses me out. So it's just a lose-lose sometimes. But I do podcasts. That's kind of where I'm at. I could tell you, I could pull up my list.
You recommend?
Well, let's see, what do I recommend? I mean, I have my sort of carousel of course, The Daily, because you just got it, I guess, these days. Of course, Rachel Maddow, Democracy Now!, Brene Brown, when I need some support. What else would I recommend? I think that's a good start, and the Intercepted is really good. It's long sometimes, but it's really good. I have all these. I'm creating a podcast right now. I'm not sure if I really want to, but so I have all these that people have recommended to me. But I'm not sure I want to recommend them to you. The Michelle Obama podcast is quite nice. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now. But I'm a podcast person.
Taking notes. And Logan, how about you? You are much more kind of social media savvy than any of us. What are you reading? What are you consuming? What might you suggest to our audience members who are looking to diversify their own base of information flow?
Well, there's 2 podcasts that I can recommend. There's one podcast called Stay in the Sun. It's actually 2 Black friends who are podcast called To the Root of It by Venus Roots. Both of them, both very good podcasts. And just like in terms of like what am I consuming, originally I was on TikTok a lot because it was the one place where I could go where I wasn't getting overloaded with like social justice stuff. And then I ended up finding social justice stuff on TikTok, and I'm like, oh my God, I need a break. I need to unplug. So I've gone back to reading. I'm currently reading All About Love by Bell Hooks. It's like, making a mess of my life in the best way possible. And I would just recommend, like, if you're looking to kind of like diversify the media that you're intaking, I would say look for the media that is going to feed your radical imagination, right? Like the radical imagination of like, what does it look like to be in a world without like police and police brutality? Like that, tapping into that imagination so that you can create and so that you can dream and exist like outside of like the dystopian society that we're currently living in. So yeah, and just like do things that bring you joy. Like if you just want to binge watch a TV show, you know, and like completely unplug from whatever, I would definitely say do that. You know, like we are living in the midst of a pandemic. And we really need to prioritize taking care of ourselves so that our body can be at its possible best that it can be to fight any of the little germs that are going around, right? Like this is the time where we really have to practice self-care and squad care, because we don't know what's coming next.
Squad. I love that. Taking notes, and look for media that will feed your radical imagination. Also, Logan, I'm also reading All About Love by Bell Hooks. So we really are the same, even though generations apart. Folks, thank you so much for spending this time with me. This has been so much fun, so informative. I am just in awe of all of you. And that concludes our program for today. And usually I try to recap what we've discussed, but we've covered so much ground here that I'm just not even going to try this time. But folks in the audience, you will receive a follow-up email. Please look out for it. In the meantime, check out Sam's documentary Disclosure on Netflix. Check out Samita's work in Teen Vogue and on samitamukhopadhyay.com. Check out Logan on soulsisterleadership.org and her documentary, Our Stories in Vivid Color. Feed your soul. Read things that are imaginative. Look out for the South. Check out Synergos at synergos.org. Sign up on our website for updates. Follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. Be safe, be kind. We love you and hope to see you again soon. Thank you, panelists, so much. Really appreciated the conversation today.